I'm Luke Delamar, and in this video from the Cinematographer's Guide to Unreal Engine, we'll be going over how to light your very first scene. We'll be working with this free coffee shop environment. You can find the link below for that. And we'll also be working towards trying to match this reference image from the film She Said, shot by cinematographer Natasha Breyer. A super quick overview, we'll be looking at different types of light actors and how to use them, and we'll use a post-process volume to control the scene exposure and maybe add a little bit of bloom and color. If you followed along in our last video, you'll have a scene like this open in front of you where we've got this coffee shop environment with pretty much all of the lighting removed. We're going to start from complete scratch today lighting-wise, so let's delete this point light, and then I'm actually going to fly the camera outside, click on this background, and delete this sphere that's in the outliner. And then we'll switch to the unlit view mode here just to fly back in and see our coffee shop. And before we continue, there's two other quick things we're going to do with the setup here. One is that I'll save this level with a different name so I can stay organized. I'll click File, Save Current Level As, and I'm just going to save it at the top here, and we'll call this Intro to Lighting. And that will automatically open that level as well. So now I'm kind of working in a separate space. And the other thing is actually a project setting that has to do with something called ray tracing. I'll click Edit, Project Settings, and I will search for ray tracing. And without getting into too much detail, the setting we need to enable is called Support Hardware Ray Tracing, which is just going to make our shadows look a lot better today. You'll get a pop-up that says you need to restart, and so I'll do that right now. Okay, so Unreal restarted, and we're back in our intro to lighting level. We'll eventually get to a whole bunch of different types of lights that you can use today, but let's start with the exterior and work our way inside. I'd like to add a sunlight and maybe a sky out the window. I'll start by clicking Window and Environment Light Mixer. This is a little dialogue that just helps us create the different actors we'll need to populate the sky outside. I'll click on Skylight, Directional Light, Sky Atmosphere, Volumetric Cloud, and Height Fog. And we can close this window. Staying organized, I'll look at my outliner here, grab these 5 actors we just created, and create a new folder called Exterior Lighting. And as always, I'll shift click this little triangle and then click it again just so we're staying organized. And immediately you'll see we've got something going on here. We've got some hard light coming in through the windows. We've got a sky with clouds. And to quickly explain what all these different actors do, let's go through them one by one. So with just the direct light on, you'll see that we get exactly that. There's no sky outside, but we are getting very sharp shadows. This directional light is infinitely far away. So even if we were to move the gizmo, which is right here, you'll notice that unless we rotate this, nothing is actually going to change. So I'll hit the E key and then I can rotate the gizmo. Another quick tip is there's a 10-degree snapping to the gizmo in Unreal. And to turn that off, it's these blue buttons at the top here. So you've got Translate, Rotate, and Scale. So I'll click this one and now I can rotate the sun without that snapping. Next up, let's turn on the Sky Atmosphere actor, and you'll see we get a horizon. What's cool about this is this reacts to the directional light. So if I rotate this sun and maybe position it so that the sun is low in our sky, you'll notice we get the natural colors of a changing horizon. Turning on Exponential Height Fog fills in the lower half of the horizon, and in short, this actor is giving us a distance haze effect, and eventually we'll also use volumetrics with this. Turning on Skylight, with the sun low like this, I didn't see much of a change, but if I were to rotate the sun again and turn that off and on, you'll see we get some reflections in the floor, so this is kind of a necessary actor to essentially give us that soft lighting from the sky. And finally, this volumetric cloud actor, you can keep it or delete it. This is just a quick way to get some clouds in Unreal. Jumping back to the directional light, one other quick tip is to move the light, you can actually hit Control L on your keyboard and move the mouse, and you get another little gizmo that shows up. And this is really useful for positioning the sun pretty quickly. I'll start right around here for now. And with all these light actors, if you look in the details panel and scroll down, there's quite a few settings you can play with. I'll be going through these in a little bit more detail throughout this video, but the main one I wanted to start with is one that's called Indirect Lighting Intensity. And so if I play with this number, the default is 1, I'll go to something like 5, you'll notice we get a whole lot more fill, a whole lot more bounce lighting as a result of the hard light we see in our scene. So this is a great way to control the contrast ratio, control fill. You can kind of adjust every light in this way. Really quickly, I'm going to take the opportunity to do a little tech fix with the environment asset in this scene. If you are using this coffee shop, you'll notice that there's a few different props in the room that seem to be glowing. That's an issue with the materials. It's something that happens quite a bit when you're kit bashing things from the marketplace. You don't really have control over how these things were made. And so for the sake of today's video, I'm just going to fix this real quick, and I promise we'll do a more in-depth video on materials later. So with something that is glowing selected, like this napkin holder, in the details panel, I will scroll down until I see materials, and let's double click this MI props. That'll open a window that has a few different settings for adjusting the material, but this quick fix that I'm going to do is actually a little bit deeper in this parent material tab. So let's double click that. And if this is your first time looking at a material graph, this might be a little daunting. Don't worry, let's just make sure we have this props node selected. And in the left of this window, under this details panel, I'm going to change this shading model from subsurface to default lit. And if I click this save button right here and close this window, now all of those props are fixed. Okay, so continuing the lighting here, let's talk about setting our scene exposure before we actually do anything else. There's a few different ways to do that with Unreal, but they all involve something called a post-process volume. I'll click this plus button at the top and search for post. And the first thing here is post-process volume. So when we add one of those to our scene, and I'm just gonna move this over here so I can see it, it looks like an orange cube. In short, this is kind of like a three-dimensional adjustment layer. And when you have that selected in your scene, the details panel has a whole bunch of different controls for color grading, for exposure. There's a whole bunch of other things. We're going to start with just exposure. In order to have this affect our whole scene and not just what's inside this cube, I'm going to search for bound and click this infinite extent button. Now I can move this below our scene so we don't have to look at it. Removing the search there and then replacing that with exposure, you'll see a few different settings show up. I'm going to click metering mode, exposure compensation, and apply physical camera exposure. And this second checkbox on the right, I will also turn off. And then auto exposure histogram, let's switch this to manual. By playing with this exposure compensation slider, we can go ahead and boost the exposure. And now you can start to see what kind of ambient light we have that makes it to the back of this room. I'm also noticing that there's a little bit of a blue cast to our fill inside, kind of lifting the shadows. I wanted to quickly mention that this is something that comes from having our environment fog in the scene. So jumping back into our exterior lighting folder and clicking on Exponential Height Fog, let's remove that search in the details panel. If I scroll down, I'll see this setting called fog density. I can change this to something like 0.01, and you'll notice that that blue cast kind of gets lowered. All right, so let's start adding a few other lights. I feel like I'm still a little overexposed here, so I'm gonna jump back into our post-process volume and maybe make this something like 4.5 under exposure compensation. I also think I may have gone a little too far with the bounced lighting here. So with the directional light selected, I can change the indirect lighting intensity maybe back to 1 for now. Okay, so let's add a few other different types of lights. I'll click the add button at the top, and under lights, we're going to start with a Rect Light. Using the gizmo, I'm going to fly this a little bit closer to our view here. And for right now, while I explain a few things, I'm actually going to turn off this exterior lighting folder. So a Rect Light is exactly what it sounds. It's a rectangular light. Other softwares commonly call this an area light. What's great about this is you can quickly change the size right here. So I can make the source width 150 by 150. And a few other settings worth noting here outside of intensity and color, this attenuation radius. So if I change this and go on the smaller side, you'll see this blue sphere. This essentially controls where the light stops casting. So this is actually a really neat trick. You can kind of immediately grip off your lights. This is normally an optimization tool in video game lighting, but for our purposes with cinematography, it's kind of like a grip tool that makes it really easy to control the fall off. Making that large again, and then scrolling down, there's barn door angle and length. So if I play with this, you'll notice we kind of have this instant skirt effect. So this is also super useful. And lastly, there's a use temperature checkbox, and this is a quick way to control the color temperature. So now that we know how this light works, let's use this to actually create a brighter and more controllable soft light from outside our window. In order to visualize this a little bit easier, let's go to Window, Viewports, and add a second viewport here. And I've dragged my viewport into the UI here. If it just pops up for you, you can drag it, and just like that, you can have two screens. And the one on the right here, I'm going to switch from lit to unlit and fly the camera outside, and then I can use the gizmo here and start moving this light. I'm going to make the color temperature 5600. Let's change the barn door length to 0 for now. And then what else? Let's make the scale quite a bit bigger. kind of like filling this whole window. And I don't really like the light hitting the ceiling right here, so I'm just going to raise this up a little bit. Something that we'll start to notice here is that the shadows are looking a little bit grainy. And so that setting we had changed earlier, ray tracing, that's something we can change per light as well, and it'll just really help the fidelity. So with the Rect Light selected, I'll search for ray, and under cast ray trace shadows, let's switch from use project setting to enabled. And just like that, you'll notice all the shadows on the ground look a lot cleaner. If you want to get rid of some of this noise, you can change the samples per pixel as well. Okay, so with that light placed, one other setting I wanted to mention was something called the Specular Scale. Kind of a virtual cheat, but worth knowing about. If I search for spec in the details panel here, and I play with this specular scale from 1 and I can go to 0, you'll notice that the reflectivity of that light source in all of the scene materials kind of goes away. This is kind of a subjective slider here. So if I thought the floor was looking too bright here and I just wanted to keep the diffuse lighting from the scene, this is how you would do that. I'll leave it at 0 for now on my end. And let's close this second viewport. I'm going to turn on the exterior lighting folder again, and let's off and on this light to see what we've got going on. So this is great. This is a really easy way to add a whole lot more natural light coming through, and we can now control the color. We can control the contrast ratio a little bit better. I'm also going to put this in a emulated folder here, and we can put both of these folders inside of a lighting folder. All right, jumping back to our reference here, let's start taking some steps towards matching it. So we don't actually have any hard light in the scene, and there's a little bit of a blue-green cast to our skylight. So back in here, I'm going to click Control L to move our sunlight, and I'm just going to pan it away so that I can keep the skylight outside. Clicking on our Rect Light, I'm going to go in and let's change this lighting color and maybe push a little bit of blue and green into it, just a tad. Another thing I'm noticing is while we're not really seeing a crisp, sharp sunlight, I do see a medium hard light with some directionality here. So let's do that with a spotlight. I'll click on plus, lights, and spotlight. One other really cool way to move light actors in Unreal is when you have something like that selected right here in the outliner, I can click Control-Shift-P, and I'm now piloting that light. So if I right click and look up, I can use the WASD keys, and I'm actually flying this light now. So I can kind of fly it out here, position it. If I click G, I get the grid that shows up. I can also switch to unlit just to kind of position things a little bit better. And maybe I'll leave it right around here, and I can click this eject button. And switching back to lit mode, let's change some of these settings for that spotlight, which I'll drag back into that emulated folder. Let's throw the intensity quite a bit brighter, and then we'll need to play with this attenuation radius so that we can have the fall off reach deeper into the scene. This light also by default right now does not have ray tracing on, so you see some kind of jagged edges. What I'll do is search for ray again and turn that to enabled. Our reference does have a little bit of softness to it, and so this is a good opportunity to talk about diffusion in Unreal Engine and how you might soften a light source. So while we're not exactly going to throw a frame in front of this light or bounce it, what we will do is change the size of the source. So back in the details panel, I'll scroll down and there's this source radius option. This is what we're going to click and drag, and immediately you'll see the softness of our beam kind of increase. I'll set it to something like 125, and then clicking on this, I might just move this up a little bit, and I'm noticing a little bit of noise as well, so I'll search for ray and set this samples per pixel back to 16. Another important setting for spotlights is the outer and inner cone angle. So this is how you'll control how narrow that beam is. So playing with this outer cone angle, you'll see I can make this much more of a narrow beam just hitting the wall. I'll leave it right around here so that we don't necessarily see it all the way on the left side. Jumping back to our reference, I might also change the color on this one. Let's switch this here. Maybe I'll make this one a little bit colder, like 8,000. And then jumping into the color, I'll play with this a bit until we have this slight green cast to it. Next up is maybe controlling the contrast and the overall fill inside this room. Outside of adjusting how the practical fixtures are affecting our scene, I'm going to place an invisible unit in our scene to help throw light deeper into our room. Looking in the outliner, I'll select the Rect Light, and then I can alt-click on the red axis here to copy or duplicate that light and drag it inside. It's obviously way too big and way too bright, so let's go ahead and change the source width and the source height. And I'll drag this over here. I'll fly a little bit closer. Maybe I'll turn off snapping for this for a second. And I kind of want to place it somewhere over here, but it's kind of spilling light all over the place. So aside from making this a little bit darker, I am going to use the barn door angle and length now. So I'll change those values here. Now, if I off and on this light, you'll notice I get some soft light reaching a little bit deeper into the room without necessarily revealing itself. One last thing before we jump back to these practical fixtures is haze and volumetrics. The way that that works in Unreal Engine is with an actor that we already have in our scene called Exponential Height Fog. So with that selected, if I scroll in the details panel and find the volumetric fog checkbox, I'm going to turn that on. And at first you notice we kind of added some contrast, but now what we can do is we can click on some of our lights, like our first Rect Light outside, and there's a setting called volumetric scattering intensity. That is essentially a multiplier of how much haze that light adds to the scene. So if I go to something like 50, you'll notice now we get all of this haze all the way back there. So that's maybe a little bit too much. I might change this to something like 10. And then if you want to globally control that haze, that would be with the height fog actor under the fog density. So maybe I'll reset this value here back to the 0.02. Another thing to make sure of here is the second Rect Light, which we had added inside. We might want to turn the volume off so that we're not necessarily seeing that source. Because, for example, if I go crazy with this, you'll notice we have this floating box of haze, and we don't really want that. So the missing thing now is this orange glow from the practicals. The last type of light we're going to work with today is a point light, so let's add one of those. I'll drag it into our emulated folder, and let's look at the settings here. So this is obviously way too bright. Let's make it 1 to start. I can fly a little bit closer to it and press G so I can see it. I'm also going to turn off the exterior lighting and maybe the other 3 lights for just a moment. So just like the other lights with source radius, we can play with the size of this light. That'll control the softness of the shadows. And if we want, we can also turn ray tracing on for this as well. What I'd like to do is make this essentially the size of one of these bulbs here. So let's go ahead and shift click the gizmo, and you can actually fly with the unit itself. And I'm going to place this right on top of one of these bulbs. This is kind of a quick and dirty way to do this. Eventually we'll talk about something called blueprints, where we can combine a mesh and a light actor and have this be a little bit more automated. But for now, let's do it like this. So I've placed this light right on top of this bulb. I'm going to jump back into the source radius, and let's maybe make this something like 3.5, and let's change the temperature to 3200. And the intensity still is way too crazy. Let's go like 0.1, and there we have it. So this is a nice little way to cheat a little light bulb here. Now you may be wondering, why don't these light bulbs do that on their own? Well, if you click on this, this is actually a mesh. And while meshes can have this emissive property to it that technically should be casting light, the way Unreal works is it's going to try and be really efficient about this. It's a much better idea to use an emissive mesh as the visual representation in this case. And by using a light actor with a little point light right there, we can control how that light changes the scene. I'm going to fast forward real quick and just duplicate this across the whole scene. All right, so I've gone ahead and done that. Let's shift click all of those point lights and put them in a folder called Practical Fixtures. And you might be noticing that there is a red X on all these lights. So without getting into too much detail, there's a few different ways that lights can be saved into a scene in Unreal. For optimization purposes, they can kind of be locked in, or it's called static. In this case, everything we're doing is dynamic. So we're going to select everything that we had just added. And there's this mobility setting. We're going to change this from stationary to movable, and that will go away. So you don't really have to do that, but if you don't want to look at that red X, that's how you fix that. Now we can turn on the rest of our lights. And I may have gone a little too far with how bright these point lights are. So let's shift click them again. And from 0.1, let's try 0.05. Let's try 0, maybe 0.02. I think 0.02 is a nice start. You'll also notice that our frame rate might be getting a little slow. And one way to check your frame rate, by the way, is to click Control-Shift-H, and you'll see that pop up. So because we had turned on ray tracing for all of these light actors, that's starting to compound and really drain the scene performance. If the scene's becoming a little too slow for you, you can start to selectively turn off ray tracing for some of these lights. I'm going to do that for all of these point lights right here. So with them all selected, I'll go from enabled to disabled. And our frame rate went up a little bit and the shadows changed, but I think I'm okay with it for this one. Looking back at our reference here, maybe we've done a little bit too much fill or a little bit too much haze, so I might do one last tweak there with the Exponential Height Fog. I'll go ahead and switch that from 0.02 to maybe 0.015. And then the second Rect Light that is right here inside, let's just look at that off and on. I think that might be a little too bright, so I'll make that 0.25. Okay, so in general, we're in a pretty good spot. One last thing that I'd like to show just to help the visual fidelity of the scene here is to add a little bit of bloom to these lights. Thankfully, we can do that with a post-process volume, which we already have in our scene. So let's click on that in the outliner. I'll make the details panel a little bigger and search for bloom. And there's a whole bunch of settings here, but what I'm gonna do is click Method, Intensity, and Threshold. There's two different options here. I might switch this to Convolution, so you get a little bit of a star filter, and I'll turn the intensity down quite a bit. You also saw that there's a little bit of a lens flare happening here. You can force those off by searching for lens flare and changing the intensity from 1 to 0. And just like that, I think we've gotten pretty close to our scene. We might not have the color palette down perfectly, but in that post-process volume is also where you might do some color grading. So if I twirl down some of these settings and then you'll see this color grading area, I can click on global and let's check out the gamma option here. And you can just do a little bit of basic grading here. And with that, I think I'm going to call it on this video for today. We've gone over how to use a few different types of light actors. You now have a nice little scene that you can play with, and it's actually really dynamic. So I could press Ctrl-L to move our sunlight again and bring that back inside to make this a little bit of a brighter scene. In future videos, we'll be going over how to work with cameras in Unreal and of course materials so you can actually change how things look. Thanks again for watching, and make sure to reach out with any questions.